The winter feast began as the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. Lanterns hung from every post and tree branch, their warm light pushing back against the early darkness. The bonfire in the center of the square roared and crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the twilight sky. All of Cedar Valley had turned out, bundled in their warmest coats and best spirits, determined to celebrate survival despite the brutal season. Eleanor arrived. As families were setting out their contributions on the long tables, there were roasted chickens and venison stew, cornbread and beans, dried apple pies, and precious jars of preserves. The feast was modest by the standards of easier years, but it was generous considering how little anyone had to spare. The sight of it, the smell of food and wood smoke and community, made Eleanor's empty stomach clench with longing she tried to ignore. Miss Hayes, little Sarah Brennan, came running, her cheeks flushed with excitement. The girl wore a coat that was too large for her, probably her older brother's, but her smile was bright enough to warm the coldest night. "Look, we brought potatoes. Mama said they're for everyone." Eleanor knelt down, steadying herself against a wave of dizziness. "That's wonderful, Sarah. Your mama is very generous. She says you're generous too. She says you give us more than lessons." The child's eyes were solemn for a moment, too knowing for her 7 years. Then she grinned and ran off to join the other children circling the bonfire. Mrs. Garrett appeared at Eleanor's elbow, pressing a tin cup of hot cider into her hands. "Drink this. You look pale as moonlight." "I'm fine," Eleanor said automatically, but she drank the cider anyway. The warmth of it spread through her chest, a temporary relief that made her realize just how cold she'd been. "It's a lovely night." "It is." Mrs. Garrett studied her with worried eyes. "But you need to eat something substantial. No arguments. I saw you give your bread to Thomas Whitaker's mother this afternoon. She has 5 children and a husband laid up with injury. She needed it more. And what good are you to anyway if you collapse?" The older woman's voice was sharp with concern. "You can't pour from an empty cup, Eleanor. You must know that." Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. There would be time to rest later, to take care of herself when the children were fed and warm and safe. Tonight was for celebration, for reminding everyone that they were a community, that they would endure. The feast began in earnest as full darkness fell. Families gathered around the fire, passing plates and sharing stories. The Murphy twins sat together under a single blanket, their faces alight with joy as they ate their first full meal in days. Thomas Whitaker's mother cried quietly while her children devoured the food Eleanor's bread had helped provide. Everywhere Eleanor looked, she saw the results of the town's collective sacrifice, and it filled her heart even as her body grew weaker. She moved through the crowd, accepting small portions when pressed, but giving most of it away when no one was watching. A bit of stew to the blacksmith's elderly father, half her cornbread to a young mother nursing an infant, the last piece of her chicken to a miner's boy who was still growing and always hungry. Each gift felt necessary, vital, more important than her own gnawing mead. At the edge of the firelight, beyond the reach of lanterns and laughter, a man stood watching. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin and wool, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. No one noticed him there in the darkness. He had a gift for being unseen, cultivated over 5 years of deliberate isolation. But his eyes never left the slender figure in the blue dress, the woman who moved through the crowd like a gentle spirit, giving and giving until there could be nothing left to give. Caleb Stone had been watching Eleanor Hayes for 8 months. Not in any way that would frighten her, not following or intruding, just making sure she was safe. He'd started after seeing her walk home alone one evening last spring, her arms full of books and her face tilted up toward the first stars. Something about her had struck him then, had pierced through the numbness he'd wrapped around himself like armor. He'd learned her routines without meaning to. Knew she arrived at the schoolhouse before dawn and often stayed past dark. Knew she walked home alone regardless of weather or hour. Knew she gave away her lunch more often than she ate it. That she mended the children's clothes during recess. That she sang sometimes when she thought no one could hear. Watching her had become a kind of meditation, a reminder that goodness still existed in the world. She'd given him something to care about again, even if she didn't know he existed. Even if he had no right to feel protective of someone who'd never spoken a word to him. Tonight, though, concern had drawn him down from his mountain cabin. The winter was worse than any he'd seen, and he knew the town was struggling. He'd arranged for extra supplies to be sent through his usual channels, anonymous donations that the town council attributed to Eastern charity. But supplies only mattered if people were strong enough to survive until Spring. Eleanor was not strong enough. He could see it from across the square, in the way she moved carefully as if the ground might shift beneath her feet, in the way she gripped the edge of the table when she thought no one was looking. He watched her give away another portion of food, watched her smile at the grateful recipient, and felt anger and admiration war in his chest. She was going to collapse. He knew it with sudden, terrible certainty. And when she did, he would have to make a choice. Stay hidden and let someone else help her, preserving the isolation that had been his refuge. Or step forward and reveal himself, risking everything he'd built to keep one stubborn, selfless woman alive. The choice was made before he even realized. He was moving. Eleanor felt it coming like a wave building in the distance. The dizziness returned, stronger this time, accompanied by a numbness in her fingers and a strange lightness in her head. The bonfire seemed too bright suddenly, the voices too loud. She needed to sit down. She needed air. She needed to get away from all these people before she caused a scene. She turned to leave, intending to walk just a little way into the darkness to catch her breath. But her legs weren't working quite right. The ground felt unstable, tilting like the deck of a ship. She took 3 steps beyond the ring of lantern light and felt the world start to spin. In her hand, she still clutched the child's mittens. Little Emma Foster had complained of cold hands, and Eleanor had been about to give the girl her own mittens, the ones her mother had knitted years ago. The last thing she owned that connected her to that gentler time. The snow rushed up to meet her. She felt herself falling, felt the cold air on her face and the resignation that came with knowing she'd pushed too far. Then, impossibly, there were arms around her. Strong arms that caught her before she hit the ground, that lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. Through the haze of near consciousness, Eleanor saw a face she didn't recognize. Hard angles and weathered skin, dark eyes full of concern, a mouth set in a grim line. He was saying something, but the words didn't make sense. The world was fading, sound and light receding like a tide going out. She felt movement, steady and sure. Felt herself pressed against a broad chest, heard a heartbeat strong and regular beneath her ear. Someone was shouting behind them, Mrs. Garrett's voice, alarmed and distant. But the man carrying her didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He walked straight into the darkness beyond the feast, into the swirling snow that had begun to fall. The blizzard came on fast, as winter storms did in the mountains. One moment the sky was clear enough to see stars. The next, the wind picked up and snow fell in thick curtains that erased the world. Caleb knew these storms, had weathered hundreds of them in his 5 years alone. He adjusted his grip on the unconscious woman in his arms and turned his face toward the mountain. The path was treacherous in good weather, nearly impossible in a blizzard, but he'd walked it so many times he could navigate by memory and instinct. His cabin was 2 miles up, 2 miles of steep climbing and narrow trails with drops on either side that would kill a man if he misstepped. He'd done harder things. He'd survived worse, but he'd never had cargo this precious, never carried something he couldn't bear to lose. Eleanor stirred once during the climb, murmuring something he couldn't make out. He held her closer, shielding her face from the wind, and kept climbing. His muscles burned. His breath came hard. But he didn't stop, didn't slow. Her life depended on reaching shelter, and failure was not something he would allow. The cabin appeared through the storm like a miracle, solid and dark against the white chaos. Caleb kicked the door open and carried Eleanor inside, laying her gently on the bed he'd built with his own hands. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, but he rebuilt it quickly, coaxing flames from kindling until light and heat filled the single room. Then he turned to the woman who'd haunted his thoughts for months, the woman he'd saved without counting the cost. Her face was too pale, her breathing too shallow. He'd kept her alive so far. Now he had to make sure she stayed that way. Caleb hung a pot of water over the fire and gathered blankets, moving with practiced efficiency. He'd tended injuries before, had learned wilderness medicine out of necessity. This was just extreme exhaustion and hunger. Treatable. Fixable. She would be fine. She had to be fine. As the storm raged outside and the fire crackled warm, Caleb Stone settled into the chair beside the bed and began the long night of keeping watch. He warmed broth and coaxed it between her lips, a spoonful at a time. He piled furs and blankets over her until color began to return to her cheeks. He checked her breathing, her pulse, the warmth of her hands, and somewhere in the deep hours of the night, as snow piled against the windows and the wind howled like a living thing, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, saving her life would give him permission to become part of it. Dawn was still hours away when Eleanor finally stirred, her eyelids fluttering. Caleb leaned forward, his heart suddenly loud in his ears. "You're safe," he said quietly, the first words he'd spoken aloud in days. "You're going to be all right." Her eyes opened, confused and frightened. Then they focused on his face, and something in her expression shifted. Not fear, something softer. Something that made him think that maybe, after 5 years of darkness, he'd finally found a reason to step back into the light. The third morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the cabin window with an intensity that made Eleanor squint. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow. Everything outside looked clean and new, as if nature had decided to start over. Caleb was already awake, tending the fire when Eleanor stirred. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled. "Good morning. You slept well." "I did." She sat up carefully, pleased to find that the dizziness had finally receded. Her body still felt weak, but it was the weakness of recovery rather than collapse. "The storm's over." "It is." Something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased about that. "Give it a day for the paths to settle, and I'll be able to get you home safely." Eleanor should have been relieved. She had responsibilities waiting students to teach, lessons to prepare, a life to return to. But instead she felt an unexpected reluctance, as if leaving this cabin would mean leaving something precious behind. "Caleb," she said carefully, "may I ask you something personal?" He straightened from the fire, giving her his full attention. "Of course. Why did you really come down to the feast that night? You said you were concerned about the winter, but there's more to it than that. Isn't there?" He was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he crossed to the chair by the bed and sat down with a sigh. "You want the full truth?" "I do." "All right." He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "I've been watching you for 8 months, longer than I admitted before. It started one evening last spring when I came down for supplies and saw you leaving the schoolhouse. You were carrying a stack of books that must have weighed half as much as you do, and you were singing some hymn I remembered from childhood. You looked so." He paused, searching for the word. "Content, like despite everything hard about frontier life, you'd found something worth celebrating." Eleanor listened without interrupting, her heart beating faster with each word. "I started coming down more often after that. Not to follow you, exactly. Just to see that you were all right, that you made it home safe, that you were still there, still giving those children hope. His voice dropped lower. It became important to me. You became important to me, even though you didn't know I existed. I saw you once, Eleanor said softly. Last autumn. I was walking home after dark, and I had the strangest feeling that someone was nearby. I looked up toward the tree line and saw a shadow move. I thought I'd imagined it. That was me. He met her eyes. Making sure you got home safe. Why didn't you ever speak to me? Introduce yourself properly? Caleb looked away, pain flickering across his features. Because I'm a man who's been broken. A man who buried his wife and daughter and didn't handle it well. I live alone in the mountains because I can't bear to be around people who remember what I lost. What right did I have to step into your life? What could I possibly offer you except the weight of my grief? You could have offered friendship, company, the knowledge that someone cared. Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. I've been so lonely, Caleb. Even surrounded by people, even with work I love, I've been achingly lonely. If I'd known there was someone who saw me, who cared whether I made it home safely, that would have meant everything. He looked at her then, and she saw the depth of regret in his eyes. I'm sorry. I thought staying away was kinder. Thought you didn't need the burden of knowing about me. Tell me about them, Eleanor said gently. Your wife and daughter. What were their names? Caleb drew a long breath, and for a moment she thought he might refuse. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. He held it carefully, as if it might crumble to dust in his hands. Margaret, he said quietly. Her name was Margaret. She was 26 when we married, the daughter of the town doctor. Smart as a whip, kind to everyone, and she loved teaching. That's why, he paused, his voice thick. That's why watching you with the children meant so much. Margaret used to talk about opening a school someday. She never got the chance. Eleanor took the photograph when he offered it. The image was faded but still clear enough to see a pretty woman with dark hair and a gentle smile, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She looks kind, Eleanor said. She was. The kindest person I ever knew. Caleb stared at the photograph. The baby came early. There were complications. The Dr. Margaret's own father, he tried everything. But sometimes trying isn't enough. We lost them both in one terrible night. Margaret first, then the baby an hour later. A daughter. We'd already picked out a name. Sarah. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry. That's a grief too heavy for anyone to carry. I didn't carry it well. His voice was rough. I stayed in town for 6 months after, trying to pretend I could go on like normal. But everywhere I looked, I saw reminders. Our house, the church where we married, the cemetery where they're buried side by side. People meant well with their sympathy, but it felt like drowning. So I left, built this cabin. Decided that being alone was easier than being around everything I'd lost. But you didn't really leave, Eleanor said. You just moved to the edges. You still make toys for the children. You still watch over people. You funded the school. She stopped as understanding dawned. It was you, the anonymous benefactor. The coal and supplies and my salary. That was you. Caleb nodded slowly. Margaret wanted a school. I couldn't give her that while she was alive, but I could make sure Cedar Valley had one after she was gone. That children would have what she dreamed of giving them. Eleanor set the photograph carefully on the table beside the bed. Then she did something that surprised them both. She reached out and took Caleb's hand, holding it firmly in both of hers. You've been carrying this alone for 5 years. That's too long. It's too heavy a burden for one person. I don't know any other way to carry it. Then maybe it's time to learn. She squeezed his hand gently. You saved my life, Caleb. You carried me through a blizzard and kept me alive when I'd given up on taking care of myself. You did that because you believed I mattered, because watching me gave you hope. Yes, then let me return the favor. Let me show you that you matter too, that you don't have to live on the edges anymore. That grief doesn't have to mean permanent exile. Caleb looked at their joined hands, his expression vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. I don't know if I remember how to be around people, how to be part of a community. You knew how to take care of me. You knew how to be gentle and patient and kind. That's enough to start with. Eleanor smiled through her tears. And I'll be there to help. If you want me to be, I want that more than I can say. His voice was barely above a whisper. But Eleanor, Miss Hayes, I need you to understand something. These feelings I have for you, they're not just gratitude or loneliness. They're real. They've been growing for months. If I come back down to town, if I let myself be part of your life, it won't be as just a friend or acquaintance. It'll be because He stopped, seemingly unable to finish. Because you care for me, Eleanor finished for him, the way I'm beginning to care for you. His eyes searched hers. You mean that? Asterisk, I do. I don't fully understand it yet. 3 days ago, I didn't know you existed. But now I can't imagine going back to how things were. Going back to being alone, even when surrounded by people. She held his gaze steadily. You see me, Caleb, really see me. And I see you too. Not the hermit everyone whispers about. Not the broken man you think you are. I see someone brave and kind who's been wounded but hasn't let that wound make him cruel. Caleb turned his hand so he was holding hers properly now, his calloused palm warm against her skin. What do we do with this? We barely know each other. We get to know each other better. Properly this time, out in the open instead of from the shadows. Eleanor felt a smile tugging at her lips, despite the seriousness of the moment. You could come down to the schoolhouse. Meet the children officially. Stop leaving toys anonymously and actually see their faces when you give them something beautiful. That sounds terrifying. It probably will be. But I'll be right there with you. We'll figure it out together. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, the future suddenly full of possibilities neither of them had dared imagine. Outside, the world was buried in snow. But inside the cabin, something new was beginning to grow. Something fragile and precious that would need care and patience to flourish. But they had time, and for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Stone had a reason to believe that time might bring something good. The 4th day in the cabin brought a shift in the atmosphere between them. The confessions of the previous day had stripped away pretense, leaving them both vulnerable, but also strangely lighter. They moved around each other with an ease that felt both new and ancient, as if they'd known each other for years. Rather than days. Eleanor was strong enough now to move around the cabin without assistance. She insisted on helping with breakfast, standing beside Caleb at the small cook stove as they prepared porridge and coffee. Their shoulders brushed as they worked in the confined space, and neither moved away. You're a good cook, Eleanor observed as Caleb added cinnamon to the porridge with practiced ease. I've had 5 years to practice. Not much else to do in winter except cook and carve. He glanced at her with a slight smile. Though I'll admit my repertoire is limited. Porridge, stew, beans, cornbread if I'm feeling ambitious. That's 3 more things than I can cook well. Mrs. Garrett usually feeds me, and I've relied on that more than I should. Eleanor stirred the pot, watching steam rise into the cool air. I should learn. It's impractical to depend on someone else for such a basic need. I could teach you, if you want. The offer came quietly, weighted with unspoken meaning. Teaching her to cook implied time together, a future that extended beyond this unexpected interlude. I'd like that. They ate by the fire, Eleanor in the comfortable chair and Caleb on a stool he'd pulled close. The morning light made everything soft-edged and warm. Eleanor found herself watching the way he ate methodically, without haste, as if he'd learned to savor meals because they marked the passage of solitary days. "I brought something with me," Eleanor said suddenly, remembering. "My mother's Bible. It was in my dress pocket when you rescued me." "Is it here?" Caleb nodded and retrieved it from the shelf, where he'd carefully placed it to dry. The small leather-bound volume was worn from years of handling, the pages soft as cloth. Eleanor took it with reverence, running her fingers over the familiar cover. "My mother read from this every evening," she said. "After my father died, it was her comfort. Then it became mine after she was gone." She opened it to a random page, finding a pressed flower marking Psalm 23. "I don't know what I believe anymore about faith in God's plan. But reading these words, it connects me to her, to who I was before I lost everything. May I hear something?" Caleb asked. "If you don't mind reading aloud." Eleanor found the passage her mother had loved best, from the book of Ruth. Her voice was soft but steady as she read, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." She looked up to find Caleb watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "My mother said that was about loyalty and love that transcends circumstance, about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It's beautiful." Caleb's voice was rough. "Margaret used to read to me sometimes. I'd forgotten how much I missed that. Hearing scripture in a gentle voice, feeling like maybe there's purpose in all this chaos." "Do you believe there's purpose? After everything you've lost?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I lost my faith when Margaret and Sarah died. Couldn't reconcile a loving God with that kind of pain. But these past months, watching you, seeing how you care for those children, how you give and give without expecting anything back, it made me think maybe I was looking at it wrong." "How do you mean?" "Maybe God doesn't stop the bad things from happening. Maybe he just makes sure we're not alone when they do. Maybe he puts people in our paths who remind us there's still good in the world." Caleb met her eyes. "Maybe he sent me to that feast to catch you when you fell." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "Or maybe he sent me to that feast so you'd have a reason to come down from this mountain. Maybe both." They sat in comfortable silence, the Bible open on Eleanor's lap, the fire crackling peacefully. Eleanor found herself thinking about the future in concrete terms for the first time. What would it mean for Caleb to rejoin the community? How would the town react to his sudden reappearance? Would they accept him, or would old gossip and suspicion make his return difficult? "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Of going back?" Terrified. He smiled without humor. "I've been alone so long, I've forgotten how to make small talk. How to sit through Sunday service without feeling like everyone's staring at the man who couldn't save his own wife. How to walk past the cemetery without falling apart. You don't have to do it all at once. Small steps. Start with the school maybe. The children won't judge you. They'll just be happy to meet the man who makes them beautiful toys. And you'll be there every step of the way. I promise." Caleb reached over and took her hand, a gesture that was becoming natural between them. "I don't deserve this." "Don't deserve you. That's grief talking, not truth. You deserve kindness, Caleb. You deserve a second chance at life." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "We both do." The day passed in quiet companionship. Caleb worked on a new carving while Eleanor read aloud from her Bible and then from her own. Memory stories about her students, her life in Ohio, the dreams she'd had as a girl. He listened to everything, asking questions that showed genuine interest, making observations that proved he understood not just what she said, but what she meant. As evening approached, Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that she didn't want to leave tomorrow. She wanted more time in this suspended space where only the two of them existed. But she also knew they couldn't hide here forever. The world was waiting. The children needed their teacher. And Caleb needed to take the first terrifying steps back into life. "Tomorrow," she said as Caleb lit the evening lantern. "We'll go down tomorrow." He nodded, and she saw the same reluctance in his eyes that she felt in her heart. But she also saw determination, resolution, the look of a man preparing to be brave. "Together," he said. "Together," she agreed that, and in that simple exchange, a promise was made. Whatever came next, however difficult or uncertain, they would face it as partners. Two wounded people who'd found each other in a blizzard and discovered that healing didn't have to be a solitary journey. The last night in the cabin was peaceful. They sat by the fire long after dark, not talking much, just being present with each other. Eleanor dozed in the chair while Caleb kept watch, the way he had that first night. But this time, she wasn't unconscious and fighting for life. This time, she was simply resting in the presence of someone who cared for her, who would keep her safe through the darkness until morning came. Asterisk. The fifth morning arrived with startling clarity, a sky so blue it hurt to look at, an air so crisp it seemed to crystallize in the lungs. Eleanor woke to find Caleb already packing supplies for their journey down the mountain. He moved with quiet efficiency, wrapping food in cloth, checking the straps on his pack, laying out her boots to make sure they were completely dry. She rose and helped him prepare, both of them moving carefully around the weight of what they were about to do. Leaving the cabin meant returning to reality, to a world that would have opinions about what had happened between them. It meant facing questions and judgment, and the complicated work of integrating Caleb back into a community that had written him off years ago. "I'll go slow," Caleb said as they finished breakfast. "The path is stable but still snow-covered. We should reach town by mid-afternoon." Eleanor nodded, pulling on her shawl and checking that her mother's Bible was safely in her pocket. As she did, her hand brushed against something else, a folded paper she didn't remember having. She pulled it out, puzzled. "What's this?" Caleb glanced over and froze. His expression shifted from calm to something closer to panic. You shouldn't." He crossed the room quickly. "Please, just put it back." But Eleanor had already begun to unfold it, curiosity overriding caution. It was an official document, dense with legal language and formal stamps. Her eyes scanned the text, trying to make sense of the words. Land deed, property rights, Cedar Valley School District. Her heart began to pound as understanding dawned. "Caleb." Her voice came out steady despite the shock coursing through her. "This is a land deed for the property where the school sits. Eleanor, I can explain, asterisk, and this name here. Caleb James Stone. That's you." She looked up at him, her mind racing. "You own the school property. You own." She kept reading, her eyes growing wider. "You own most of the land around Cedar Valley. This says your father's estate included mineral rights and timber claims, and my father was a wealthy man." Caleb's voice was tight. "When he died, everything came to me. I never wanted it, never asked for it, but it's mine regardless." Eleanor's hands trembled as she held the document. "The anonymous benefactor. The one who pays my salary and supplies the coal and sends books twice a year. That's you? It's been you all along." "Yes." She sank into the chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "The town council thinks it's some Eastern charity. They talk about how fortunate we are to have a distant patron who cares about education. But it's not distant at all. It's you, living 2 miles away, watching over everything." Caleb knelt in front of her, his face earnest and worried. "I didn't mean to deceive you. I didn't mean to deceive anyone. Just after Margaret died, I needed to do something meaningful with all that money. It felt wrong to have so much when others had so little. And Margaret loved teaching, loved children. Funding a school seemed like the right way to honor her memory. Why didn't you tell me?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "When we were sitting here sharing our grief, sharing our stories. Why didn't you? Mention that you've been the one ensuring I had food and warmth and supplies to teach with? Because I didn't want you to feel obligated to me. Didn't want you to think my feelings came with strings attached. He reached for her hands, but she pulled them away. Eleanor, please understand. The money doesn't matter. What matters is that those children get educated. That you have what you need to teach them. Whether I'm involved or not, that work needs to continue. Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin. Her mind felt like a storm of conflicting emotions. Gratitude warred with feeling manipulated. Understanding battled with hurt. She'd thought she knew him, thought she understood the situation. But this changed everything. How much? She asked quietly. What? How much of what I thought was my life, my independent life, was actually you pulling strings? She turned to face him. The school building, my salary. The coal that keeps the children warm. The books I teach from? All of it was you? The town council approves your salary. I just make sure the funds are available. Caleb stood slowly, his expression pained. Eleanor, you've earned every penny. The work you do, the lives you touch, you deserve far more than what you're paid. That's not the point. She pressed her hands to her temples, trying to organize her thoughts. The point is that I've been living a fiction, thinking I was making my own way, building something through my own efforts. But really, I was a charity case for a wealthy man who felt sorry for me. No, Caleb's voice was sharp, almost angry. That's not what this was. I don't feel sorry for you. I admire you. I watch you do more with limited resources than most people could do with unlimited funds. You're not a charity case. You're the reason I kept living when I wanted to give up. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. Then why hide it? Why not just be honest from the start? Because I didn't know how to be part of the world anymore. Because stepping out of the shadows meant risking rejection and pain, and all the things I'd been running from. He took a step toward her. Because I was a coward who couldn't face the possibility that you might look at me and see just a broken man with money, instead of someone worth knowing. The raw honesty in his voice broke through her anger. Eleanor sank back into the chair, exhausted by the emotional whiplash of the morning. I don't know what to think right now. Then don't think. Just listen. Caleb knelt in front of her again, his dark eyes pleading. I should have told you about the money. You're right. You deserve to know. But everything else I've said, everything I've shared about my feelings, about watching you, about wanting to be part of your life, all of that was true. The money is just money. It's you that matters. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the fear in his eyes, the desperate hope that she wouldn't turn away. She saw the man who'd carried her through a blizzard, who'd kept her alive through the night, who'd shared his deepest grief because she'd asked. Money didn't change any of that. Money didn't make his feelings less real or her feelings less genuine, but it did complicate things. It shifted the balance between them in ways she'd need time to understand. I need to think, she said finally. This is a lot to process. I understand. Caleb stood, giving her space. Take all the time you need. But Eleanor, please know that I never meant to hurt you. Everything I did was to help the school, to honor Margaret's memory, and yes, to make sure you had what you needed to do your work. Not because I thought you were helpless, but because I could help, and it seemed wrong not to. Eleanor nodded slowly. She believed him. That was the hardest part. She still believed him. Still trusted that his motivations had been good, even if his methods had been flawed. But trust and understanding didn't erase the shock or the feeling of having the ground shift beneath her feet. She stood and gathered her things, moving with mechanical precision. Caleb watched her with obvious worry, but didn't try to stop her or press for reassurance. They prepared to leave in heavy silence, the easy companionship of the previous days, replaced by careful distance. The journey down the mountain was difficult in more than just a physical sense. The path was treacherous with snow, requiring concentration and care. but the emotional distance between them was equally challenging to navigate. They walked single file, Caleb leading the way and occasionally glancing back to make sure Eleanor was managing the descent safely. She was grateful for his care even in her confusion. That was the thing about Caleb. His protectiveness felt genuine, rooted in who he was rather than any sense of obligation or ownership. He'd saved her life before knowing she'd accept him. He'd watched over her for months without expecting anything in return. The money was just another expression of that same impulse to care for people, to make sure they had what they needed to thrive. But it was still a shock. Still a revelation that changed the shape of everything she'd thought she understood. They stopped halfway down to rest and share water from Caleb's canteen. The valley spread out below them, Cedar Valley looking small and peaceful in the winter sunlight. From this distance, Eleanor could see the schoolhouse, a dark speck against the white landscape. Her home, her purpose, the life she built from nothing. Except it hadn't been nothing. It had been built on a foundation she didn't know existed, funded by a man she'd never met but who'd watched over her from the shadows. The realization was dizzying. "I'm not angry," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I want you to know that. I'm just overwhelmed, trying to understand what this means." Caleb looked at her with relief so profound it made her chest ache. "That's more than I deserve. More than I had any right to hope for. You should have told me sooner, before we shared what we shared. Before I started having feelings that now feel complicated by all this. I know, I was going to tell you. That night at the feast, I was planning to finally introduce myself properly, to start building a real connection instead of watching from afar. But then you collapsed, and everything happened so fast, and..." He stopped, shaking his head. "There's no excuse. I should have been honest immediately." Eleanor studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the sunlight caught in his dark hair. She thought about the past 4 days, the conversations they'd shared, the way he'd cared for her. Money couldn't fake that kind of tenderness. Wealth couldn't purchase the look in his eyes when he told her about Margaret and Sarah. "When we get to town," she said slowly, "there will be questions. Mrs. Garrett will want to know everything. The town council will need reassurances that nothing improper happened. People will talk, I know. And at some point, the truth about the funding will come out. You can't hide your identity forever if you're planning to rejoin the community." "I know that too." Caleb met her eyes. "I'm ready for it. Or at least I'm ready to try. With you beside me, if you're still willing." Eleanor took a deep breath of the cold, clean mountain air. "I'm still willing. But Caleb, we need to be honest with each other from now on. No more secrets. No more watching from the shadows. If we're going to build something real, it has to be based on truth." "No more secrets," he agreed. "I promise you that." They resumed their descent, and with each step, Eleanor felt the shock beginning to settle into something more manageable. Understanding, perhaps, or at least acceptance that life was rarely as simple as it appeared, that the man who'd saved her life had been weaving through it, in invisible ways for longer than she'd known Dot by the time they reached the outskirts of town. The sun was beginning its descent toward the peaks. Cedar Valley looked exactly as Eleanor had left it 5 days ago, but she felt fundamentally changed. She'd gone up that mountain as a woman alone, exhausted and half-starved. She was returning as someone who'd been seen, cared for, and valued. The money complicated things, but it didn't change the essential truth. Caleb Stone had caught her when she fell, and she was choosing to believe that everything else, all the secrets and revelations, could be navigated together. As they walked toward Mrs. Garrett's boarding house, Eleanor reached out and took Caleb's hand. He looked at her in surprise, hope flickering in his dark eyes. "Together," she said simply. He squeezed her hand gently. Together. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Mrs. Garrett nearly fainted when she opened the door and saw Eleanor standing on the porch with the mountain man beside her. The older woman's hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide with shock and relief, and 100 questions all trying to escape at once. "Eleanor Hayes, you scared 10 years off my life." She pulled Eleanor into a fierce embrace, then stepped back to examine her from head to toe. "Are you hurt? Are you well?" The whole town's been beside themselves with worry. "We searched everywhere after the storm hit, thinking you'd—" She stopped abruptly, seeming to notice Caleb for the first time. "And you're Caleb Stone. I remember you, though it's been years." "You saved her." "I did what anyone would have done, ma'am." Caleb removed his hat, holding it respectfully. "I'm sorry for the worry I caused. The storm made it impossible to bring her down safely until today." Mrs. Garrett studied him with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded briskly and ushered them both inside. Come in. You both look frozen. I'll put coffee on and get Eleanor fed properly. Lord knows that girl needs a good meal." The boarding house parlor was warm and familiar, unchanged from when Eleanor had left 5 days ago. But everything felt different now, viewed through the lens of her experience in the mountain cabin. This place had been her home, but it had never felt as safe as those 4 walls with Caleb keeping watch. Mrs. Garrett bustled around, preparing food and firing questions at Eleanor while casting curious glances at Caleb. He sat in the corner chair, quiet but present, letting Eleanor navigate the explanations in her own way. She told a version of the truth that left out the depth of feeling that had developed between them, focusing instead on the rescue, the storm, and the practical necessity of waiting for safe travel conditions. And he was a perfect gentleman? Mrs. Garrett asked pointedly, looking between them. "He saved my life and asked nothing in return," Eleanor said firmly. "I owe him everything." Mrs. Garrett's expression suggested she suspected there was more to the story, but she didn't press. "Well then, Mr. Stone, you have my gratitude. This town would be much poorer without our schoolteacher." Word of Eleanor's return spread quickly through Cedar Valley. By evening, a steady stream of visitors had come to the boarding house, concerned parents wanting to see that she was well, town council members asking careful questions about the propriety of the situation, children who'd missed her and brought small gifts of welcome. Through it all, Caleb remained present but unobtrusive, letting Eleanor take the lead, but making it clear he wasn't hiding anymore. The reactions to his reappearance varied. Some of the older residents remembered him from before his tragedy and greeted him with cautious warmth. Others eyed him with suspicion, uncertain about the hermit who'd suddenly emerged from isolation. A few whispered behind their hands, starting rumors that Eleanor could feel but chose to ignore. Sarah Brennan came with her mother, the little girl throwing herself at Eleanor with relieved tears. "I thought you were gone forever, Miss Hayes. I thought the snow took you away." Eleanor held the child close, stroking her hair. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just got caught in the storm. But Mr. Stone here made sure I stayed safe and warm." Sarah turned to look at Caleb with wide, curious eyes. Then recognition dawned on her face. "You're the one who leaves the toys. I saw you once, putting a doll on the church steps." "I got that doll. I still have her." Caleb's weathered face softened. "I'm glad she found a good home. Why did you leave her if you wanted me to have her? Why didn't you just give it to me?" The simple, honest question from a child cut through all the adult complications. Caleb knelt down so he was at her level. "Because I was sad for a long time, and I forgot how to talk to people. But your teacher reminded me that hiding isn't the same as healing. So I'm trying to be braver now." Sarah seemed to accept this with the easy grace of childhood. "I'm glad. It's nicer when people are together instead of alone." Then she hugged him quickly before running back to her mother. That moment shifted something in the room. The other children who'd been hanging back, uncertain about this strange man, now came forward with questions and stories. They'd all received his anonymous gifts at some point: a carved bird, a spinning top, a small wooden wagon. Knowing the maker had a face, a name, made them eager to connect. Eleanor watched Caleb interact with them, saw the stiffness gradually leave his shoulders as he answered their questions and accepted their thanks. This was what he needed, she realized. Not grand gestures or dramatic returns, but simple human connection. The acknowledgement that he existed, that he mattered, that his gifts had brought joy. As the evening wore on and the visitors finally departed, Mrs. Garrett insisted Caleb stay for supper. He accepted with visible gratitude, and the three of them sat together at the small dining table. The meal was simple but abundant, the opposite of the sparse rations Eleanor had been living on for months. "I have a question," Mrs. Garrett said as they finished eating, "and I hope you'll forgive an old woman's bluntness. What happens now? You've returned to town, Mr. Stone, but to what purpose? Are you planning to stay, or will you retreat to your mountain again?" Caleb glanced at Eleanor before answering. "I'm planning to stay, if the town will have me. I've been alone long enough. It's time to try living again instead of just surviving." "And what role does our Eleanor play in these plans?" The older woman's eyes were sharp but not unkind. "That's for Eleanor to say." Caleb met her gaze steadily. "I have feelings for her. I won't pretend otherwise. But I'm not presuming anything. She needs time to adjust to all this. Time to decide what she wants." Mrs. Garrett nodded slowly, then turned to Eleanor. "And you, child? What do you want?" Eleanor took a breath, feeling the weight of the question. What did she want? A week ago, she would have said she wanted to keep teaching, to serve the children, to make a small difference in the world. Those things were still true. But now there was more. Now there was the possibility of partnership, of shared life, of not facing every day alone. "I want him to stay," she said quietly. "I want the chance to see where this goes. To build something real based on truth and choice rather than circumstances and secrets." "Good." Mrs. Garrett stood and began clearing plates. "Then we'll need to manage the town gossip carefully. People will talk regardless, but we can shape the narrative if we're strategic. Mr. Stone, you'll need to make yourself useful. Volunteer at the school. Help with community projects. Show folks you're not the ghost they've made you out to be." "I can do that." Caleb looked almost relieved to have concrete actions to take. "I'm good with my hands. I can repair things, build things, whatever's needed. And Eleanor, you'll need to be careful about appearances. No spending time alone with him unchaperoned. At least not until—" She paused meaningfully. "Well, until the situation is more formalized." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding the implication. Marriage. Mrs. Garrett was already thinking ahead to marriage. It was too soon for that, too fast. But the older woman was right about one thing: frontier communities had strict social codes. And being caught alone with a man could ruin Eleanor's reputation and her position as teacher. "We'll be careful," Eleanor promised. Later, after Caleb had returned to make arrangements at the town's modest hotel, Eleanor sat with Mrs. Garrett by the fire. The older woman was knitting, her needles clicking rhythmically in the quiet room. "You care for him," Mrs. Garrett said without looking up from her work. "I do." There was no point in denying it. "Is that foolish? We've known each other such a short time. Time isn't always the measure of connection. I knew my Henry for 3 days before I knew I'd marry him. We had 42 good years together before the fever took him." She paused in her knitting. "What matters is character. And from what I've seen, Caleb Stone has good character. He's been wounded, yes, but wounds don't make a man bad. Sometimes they make him better, more careful with other people's pain. He's been funding the school. Did you know that? He's the anonymous benefactor everyone talks about." Mrs. Garrett's needles stilled. "Is he now? Well, that explains a few things. The regularity of the donations. The fact that they kept coming, even in hard years. She resumed knitting. Does that bother you? It did it at first. It felt like a betrayal, like he'd been manipulating my life without my knowledge. Eleanor stared into the fire. But I'm coming to understand that he was just trying to help. To do something meaningful with money he never wanted in the first place. And now? Now, I think we need to be honest with the town. About who he is, about the funding, about everything. No more shadows or secrets. Eleanor looked at her friend. That's going to cause problems, isn't it? Some people won't like knowing the hermit has been supporting them. Some people won't like anything that challenges their assumptions, Mrs. Garrett agreed. But most folks will be grateful. Times are hard. Having a benefactor who's actually part of the community, that's better than some faceless Eastern charity. Over the next week, Eleanor and Caleb worked to establish a new normal. He took a room at the hotel, but spent his days helping around town. He repaired the schoolhouse steps that had been sagging. He brought wood for families who were running low. He showed up at the general store with furs to trade, engaging in conversation instead of conducting his business in silence and leaving. The children adored him. He came to the schoolhouse each afternoon and taught them woodcraft, how to whittle safely, how to identify trees by their bark, how to move quietly through the forest. Eleanor watched him with her students and saw the man Margaret must have known. The father he would have been if tragedy hadn't intervened. But the town council remained skeptical. They called a meeting to discuss the situation, and Eleanor knew it was time for full disclosure. She and Caleb prepared carefully for that conversation, knowing that what they revealed could change everything. The night before the meeting, Caleb came to the boarding house with a small package wrapped in cloth. Mrs. Garrett discreetly left them alone in the parlor, keeping the door open for propriety's sake, but giving them privacy. "I have something for you," Caleb said, holding out the package. Eleanor unwrapped it carefully and caught her breath. Inside was a silver locket on a delicate chain, beautifully crafted with intricate scrollwork. She opened it and found a tiny portrait inside, a painting of herself with her students, captured in exquisite miniature detail. "How did you? I commissioned it months ago. From an artist in Helena who works from descriptions." Caleb's voice was soft. "I wanted you to have it, to see yourself as I see, as someone who brings light into dark places, who makes the world better just by being in it." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. The portrait showed her surrounded by children, her face lit with joy and purpose. It was how she felt in her best moments, when teaching felt less like work and more like calling. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I was going to leave it anonymously, like the toys. But then you collapsed, and I carried you up the mountain, and everything changed." He reached out tentatively and took her hand. "I don't want to be anonymous anymore, Eleanor. I want to be part of your life. Openly, honestly, for as long as you'll have me." Eleanor looked at the locket, then at Caleb's face, weathered and earnest, full of hope and fear in equal measure. Tomorrow they would face the town council. There would be questions and judgment and complications. But tonight, in this quiet moment, everything felt simple and true. "Help me put it on?" she asked. He fastened the chain around her neck with gentle hands, his fingers warm against her skin. The locket settled at her throat, a tangible reminder that she was seen, valued, loved. "Tomorrow might be difficult," Eleanor said. "People might not understand. Some might even try to force us apart. Let them try." Caleb's voice was steady. "I spent 5 years hiding from life. I'm not hiding anymore. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Eleanor touched the locket, feeling its weight against her heart. Together, she agreed. And in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that whatever the town council decided, whatever obstacles lay ahead, she'd made the right choice. Not just in accepting Caleb's feelings, but in opening her own heart to the possibility of love after loss, of building something new from the ruins of old grief. The future was uncertain. But for the first time in years, that uncertainty felt like promise rather than threat. The weeks following the council meeting brought changes to Cedar Valley that rippled through the community like spring water through thawing ground. Caleb became a fixture in town. No longer the mysterious mountain hermit, but a man with a name, and a face and a willingness to help wherever help was needed. He arrived at the schoolhouse every morning to stoke the fire before Eleanor and the students arrived. He repaired the wobbly benches that had been making children uncomfortable for years. He built proper bookshelves to hold the growing library of texts he'd been quietly purchasing and sending. The children grew accustomed to his presence, greeting him with enthusiasm and showing him their work with pride. Eleanor watched him transform from a man who'd forgotten how to be around people into someone the community relied upon. He attended church services, sitting in the back pew but present nonetheless. He joined the men's work crews that kept the town functioning through winter's end. He donated lumber from his timber holdings for necessary repairs around town. Slowly, steadily, Cedar Valley remembered that Caleb Stone wasn't just the man who'd lost everything. He was also the man who'd chosen to stay and help even in his grief. Mrs. Garrett became their unofficial chaperone, always present when Caleb came to the boarding house for supper, always finding excuses to leave them alone for brief moments while remaining within proper bounds. She seemed to take particular pleasure in the courtship, often remarking that she'd known from the first moment she saw them together that this was meant to be, that there were still hurdles to overcome. Some townspeople remained suspicious, unable or unwilling to move past their assumptions about the hermit who'd returned. Banker Williams in particular seemed resistant to accepting Caleb's integration, though, whether from genuine concern or from some other motivation, Eleanor couldn't quite determine. It was on a cold March evening, with early spring struggling to break winter's hold, that Caleb came to the boarding house with unusual determination in his eyes. Mrs. Garrett took one look at him and announced she needed to check on something in the kitchen, leaving them alone in the parlor with the door carefully ajar. Caleb stood by the fire, turning his hat in his hands with uncharacteristic nervousness. Eleanor set down her mending and waited, sensing something significant was about to happen. "I've been thinking," he began, then stopped. Started again. "Eleanor, these past weeks with you they've reminded me what it means to be alive instead of just surviving. You've given me a reason to face each day with something besides duty or obligation. You've given me hope." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. "You've given me the same thing. Partnership, understanding, the knowledge that I don't have to carry everything alone." He crossed to her chair and knelt down, just as he had that first morning in the cabin when she'd woken confused and frightened. But this time, there was no fear in his eyes, only certainty and love. "I want to give you more than hope. I want to give you a future, a home, a family, if you'll have me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, carved with intricate patterns that must have taken hours to complete. Inside were two simple gold bands, clearly very old. "These were my parents' wedding rings. My father made them himself when he married my mother. They represent commitment and work and the kind of love that endures through hardship." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the rings, then at Caleb's earnest face. "I know it's not been long by conventional standards. I know people will say we're rushing into this. But Eleanor, I've loved you for months. I've watched you give and give until you had nothing left. I've seen your strength and your kindness and your absolute dedication to making the world better. I don't need more time to know that I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure you never have to face the world alone again." He took a shaky breath. "Eleanor Hayes, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making sure you're cared for the way you care for everyone else? Will you help me build something new from the ruins of old grief?" Eleanor couldn't speak past the emotion clogging her throat. All the loneliness of the past years, all the exhaustion and struggle and determined solitude, it all led to this moment. To this man kneeling before her with his heart in his hands, offering her everything he had. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, Caleb, I'll marry you." His face transformed with joy so pure it took her breath away. He slipped a smaller ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then Eleanor took the larger ring and placed it on his hand, sealing the promise between them. Caleb stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her close while she cried happy tears against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady, a rhythm she'd come to depend on more than she'd realized. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I love your strength and your kindness. I love how you see the best in people. I love that you gave me a reason to step back into life." "I love you too," Eleanor said, pulling back just enough to see his face. "I love your gentle heart. I love how you care for people even when it costs you everything. I love that you caught me when I fell and never let me go." Mrs. Garrett appeared in the doorway, her eyes bright with tears and her face split by a knowing smile. "I suppose congratulations are in order?" "We're getting married," Eleanor said, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "Of course you are." Mrs. Garrett came forward and embraced them both. "I'll stand as witness, naturally. And we'll need to plan a proper ceremony. Nothing fancy. I know neither of you would want that, but something meaningful. Something that honors what you've both overcome to find each other." Over the next hour, they made plans. A simple wedding in the church, with the children from the school in attendance. Dr. Morrison would perform the ceremony. He'd known both Caleb's parents and Margaret, and his presence would provide a link between past and future. Mrs. Garrett would prepare a small reception at the boarding house. The whole town would be invited, giving them a chance to celebrate openly rather than hiding their love. When? Mrs. Garrett asked practically. Spring would be lovely, once the weather fully turns. Caleb looked at Eleanor, leaving the decision to her. She thought about waiting, about taking time to plan something elaborate. But then she remembered what Caleb had said about not needing more time, about knowing what he wanted and being ready to commit to it. 2 weeks, she said. "I don't want to wait. I've spent enough of my life waiting for someday. I want to start building our future now." 2 weeks it is, Caleb agreed, his voice warm with approval as the evening wore on and plans took shape. Eleanor kept touching the ring on her finger, marveling at how much her life had changed. 2 months ago, she'd been alone and slowly starving herself through misguided selflessness. Now she had a partner, a future, and the promise of building something meaningful together. That night, after Caleb had reluctantly returned to his hotel room and Eleanor was preparing for bed, she looked at herself in the mirror. The locket Caleb had given her glinted at her throat. The ring sparkled on her finger. But more than any physical token, it was the light in her own eyes that struck her. She looked alive in a way she hadn't in years. She looked happy. "Thank you," she whispered to the universe, to God, to whatever force had brought Caleb to the winter feast that night. "Thank you for catching me when I fell." Outside her window, snow was beginning to melt. Spring was coming, bringing with it the promise of new growth, new beginnings, and the kind of love that could heal even the deepest wounds. In 2 weeks, Eleanor Hayes would become Eleanor Stone, and together, they would build a life that honored both the past they'd lost and the future they'd found in each other's arms. Spring came to Cedar Valley with the kind of gentle insistence that made winter feel like a distant memory. Snow melted into streams that sang their way down the mountains. Green shoots pushed through thawed earth. The air warmed and softened, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. 3 months had passed since the wedding, a simple ceremony that had drawn the whole town and left hardly a dry eye in the church. Eleanor and Caleb had stood before Dr. Morrison and spoken vows that promised partnership through whatever joys and sorrows life might bring. The children had scattered wildflowers in the aisle. Mrs. Garrett had wept openly. Even Banker Williams had seemed moved by the evident love between the couple. Now, on a bright May afternoon, Eleanor stood at the window of the expanded schoolhouse and watched her husband work. The building had been transformed over the winter months. What had once been a single cramped room now boasted 2 classrooms, a proper library, and a workshop where Caleb taught older students woodcraft and practical skills. The carved wooden sign above the door read Hayes Stone Academy, a name that honored both her work and their partnership. Caleb was outside with a group of boys, showing them how to properly joint wood for a bookshelf they were building together. His patience with them was infinite. He corrected mistakes gently, praised good work genuinely, and made each child feel capable and valued. Watching him, Eleanor felt her heart swell with love and gratitude for the man who'd caught her when she fell and then built a life with her worth standing for. Mrs. Stone? Sarah Brennan tugged at Eleanor's skirt, her face bright with excitement. Can I show Mr. Caleb the bird I carved? I followed his instructions exactly like he taught us. I'm sure he'd love to see it, sweetheart. Why don't you take it out to him? Sarah scampered off, clutching her small wooden bird with pride. Eleanor watched through the window as Caleb examined the girl's work with serious attention, pointing out where she'd done well and offering gentle suggestions for improvement. Sarah glowed under his praise, and Eleanor knew that carving would be treasured for years to come. The sound of a wagon drew Eleanor's attention to the road. Mrs. Garrett was arriving with supplies: fresh bread, vegetables from the early garden, and letters from back east that had finally made their way through the spring thaw. Eleanor went to meet her, accepting the bundle of correspondence with thanks. You're looking well, Mrs. Garrett observed, studying Eleanor with the practiced eye of someone who'd known her for years. More than well. You're thriving. I am. Eleanor couldn't deny it. The constant exhaustion that had plagued her for years had lifted. She ate regular meals now, prepared by Caleb or Mrs. Garrett, or sometimes her own improving hand. She slept through the nights in the comfortable home Caleb had built for them. Not the mountain cabin, but a new house on the edge of town with space for the family they hoped to build. She woke each morning to warmth and partnership, and the knowledge that she wasn't facing the day alone. Caleb's thriving too, Mrs. Garrett continued. I remember him from before the tragedy. He was a good man then, but there was something unformed about him. Now he's grown into himself, found his purpose. We found it together, Eleanor said softly. I couldn't have done this without him. The school, the children, all of it. It makes me better. Makes me remember to take care of myself so I can take care of others. That's what love should do. Should make you better, stronger, more yourself. Mrs. Garrett patted Eleanor's hand. I'm glad you both found each other. Glad that terrible winter night led to something so beautiful. Eleanor thought about that night often. The cold, the dizziness, the sensation of falling. She thought about Caleb's arms catching her, his determination to keep her alive. The days in the cabin where they'd learned each other's stories and hearts. It had been terrifying and wonderful and completely transformative. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if he hadn't been there, Eleanor admitted. If he'd stayed on his mountain that night, but he didn't. He came down and he saved you, and in doing so, he saved himself. Mrs. Garrett smiled. That's the way these things work sometimes. We save each other without even meaning to. That evening, after the students had gone home and the schoolhouse was quiet, Eleanor and Caleb walked together toward their house. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose that reminded Eleanor of that first winter feast, the night her old life ended and her new one began. I have news, Eleanor said as they walked, her hand tucked into Caleb's arm. He looked at her with immediate attention. Good news? The best news. She placed her free hand on her stomach, where new life was just beginning to make itself known. We're going to have a baby. Come autumn, we'll be 3 instead of 2. Caleb stopped walking. His face cycled through shock, joy, fear, and then settled on something that looked like wonder. Are you certain? Dr. Morrison confirmed it this morning. He says I'm healthy and strong, and there's no reason to think. She stopped, realizing what he was afraid of. What memories this news must be bringing back. Caleb, I'm not Margaret. This isn't 5 years ago. Dr. Morrison is experienced now in ways he wasn't then. And I'm healthy. We'll be careful and watchful, and everything will be fine. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with desperate tenderness. I can't lose you. I can't, Eleanor. I only just found you. The thought of, you won't lose me. She held him tightly, feeling his fear and understanding it completely. I'm not going anywhere. We're going to have this baby, and we're going to raise them together. And we're going to teach them about kindness and courage and how to carve beautiful things from wood. A baby. Caleb pulled back enough to see her face, and now his expression was pure joy. We're having a baby. We are. Are you happy? Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He laughed, a sound of such pure delight that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. I never thought after losing Sarah, I never thought I'd get another chance at being a father. And now, he placed his hand gently on her stomach. Now everything feels possible again. They stood there on the road as the sun set and the first stars appeared. 2 people who'd been broken and alone finding wholeness in each other. Around them, Cedar Valley settled into evening quiet. Smoke rose from chimneys. Families gathered for supper. Children called to each other in the lingering twilight. Do you remember that first morning? Eleanor asked. When I woke up in your cabin, confused and frightened? I remember everything. The way you looked at me, trying to figure out if I was dangerous. The way you thanked me even though you could barely speak. The way you trusted me without any reason to. I had reason. I saw it in your eyes, that you were someone who would keep me safe. Eleanor smiled up at him. I was right. We kept each other safe. Caleb brushed a strand of hair from her face. That's what we'll keep doing. For each other, for this baby, for all the children who need people to believe in them. They walked the rest of the way home hand in hand, talking about the future, about cribs to build and names to choose, and how they'd manage teaching with an infant. But underneath the practical planning was a deeper current of gratitude. Gratitude for the storm that had brought them together. For the kindness that had saved a life. For the courage it took to love again after lost Dot above them. The sky deepened to indigo and filled with stars. The mountains stood eternal and watchful, and in a small house on the edge of Cedar Valley, a lamp was lit in the window, a beacon of warmth and welcome that said this was a place where love lived, where the wounded could heal, where second chances were possible. Eleanor Hayes had collapsed during the winter feast with no hope of tomorrow, but she'd woken in a mountain man's shelter and found a future beyond anything she'd imagined. Found partnership and purpose and the kind of love that catches you when you fall and then teaches you to fly. The kindest hearts carry the heaviest burdens, but they need not carry them alone. That was the truth Eleanor and Caleb had learned together. The truth they would pass on to their child and to every student who walked through the doors of Haystone Academy. Some burdens are too heavy to bear alone. But together, anything is possible, Dot. And in the end, that made all the difference.